right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is J.M. Dixon, and I am an intern here at Interfaith Philadelphia. And welcome to the opening session for our series on interfaith chaplaincy. We have some great guests here today from Lancaster Theological Seminary, and we're going to meet them here in a minute. We have Zach Brown, not Zachary, Kevin Long, and Spring Davidson. So we're very excited for this. And so we're going to start out and we'll start with Zach and have him introduce himself and just share a little bit about, and this will go to each one of you. So to just share a little bit about your religious background and where you go to school, which I guess we've already answered that, but yeah, take it away there, Zach.
Greetings in the name of our wonderful God. Appreciate being asked to be here. And my name's Zach or Zachary, whichever you want. I go by Zach. I've always thought it's quicker to get my attention rather than shouting my whole name. I don't know if that's a great reason or not, but whatever. I've been a United Methodist pastor for the past 5 years, and will be graduating this May from LTS with my Master's of Divinity, seeking commissioning and then eventual ordination as an elder in the United Methodist Church. So I've grown up in the United Methodist Church all my life. My dad's been an elder for probably 30 to 40 years, and love doing CPE and chaplaincy work. In fact, have strongly considered doing that after some point after serving the local church. So I'm glad to be here and glad to provide whatever expertise that I can.
Great, thanks. Kevin, all you now.
I'm Kevin Long. I live near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you today. I've done a variety of different things in my life. A few years ago, I retired from a 20-year career in cybersecurity, and that was I was able, because of Lancaster Seminary's weekend program, I was able for most of my seminary career to do both. But I just got to the point where the requirements for the Presbyterian Church got to be more than I could handle, along with seminary and the job, and so I retired from that career, and I've been concentrating on seminary and then the field ed in a local church last year, and then CPE alongside my seminary classes this year. I've been a member of different faith traditions. Probably I was Methodist longer than any of the others, and then became a Presbyterian in more recent years, not long before I began seminary. And my hope is to start a new worshiping community within PCUSA in the coming months.
Great, so glad to hear it. I too have a background in the Presbyterian Church, so I'm familiar with some of that. Okay. So let's start out with just, you kind of talked about it a little bit, but I'd like to hear more about why you chose to do theological education and chaplaincy experience. Was that, I know I'm at Princeton Theological Seminary, and a lot of students, particularly in the Presbyterian denomination, are required to do chaplaincy as part of their ordination process. So like hear a little bit about both your interest in theological education and in why you chose to spend some time in chaplaincy.
Is that directed at, yeah, I'll let Zach go first.
That's either one of you, yeah.
Whichever. Theological education, I think the thing that I've gotten out the most of it is the being careful when we practice ministry, being aware that things are not as black and white as people believe them to be. That's huge, especially in the United Methodist Church right now, and being aware that we shouldn't be using the Bible in ways that harm people, or that lift people up without looking at all of the context. And CPE, well, so first off, I'll be honest, I was required to do it by my conference. It differs by conference, but CPE is something I think that anyone who wants to do ministry should be doing, regardless of requirement or not. I think that it's just such a core way of being. I mean, my ministry has shifted so much from doing CPE. I mean, I made visits with my dad, and of course I've made visits as a pastor, but it changed a lot of how I talk to and relate to other people. And so yeah, I would encourage anybody to do it. I had a great experience at Christiana Hospital. And so, I would, vouch for them anytime if anybody wanted to do it, that, that is a good place to go. So.
For me, I've been involved in church my entire life, and I reached a point where I felt a strong call to seminary to become equipped to do whatever I was being equipped to do next in my life. I just wasn't adequately prepared for whatever that was going to be. And I didn't know what that was going to be when I began seminary. I assumed it would be nonprofit work, and I've since been steered in a different direction. But it's been an incredibly valuable experience. I actually agree with everything Zach just said, which is unusual. So I'll take the opportunity to point that out. The CPE, as for Zach, it's a requirement for PCUSA, but I would hate to go into parish ministry without having done CPE. Just the learning how to be a witness in those circumstances and to just exist alongside people. It's a different mindset. It's a different way of doing things. So I've been very grateful for my experience. I'm at Hershey Medical Center in Hershey, Pennsylvania.
So you all have already talked a little bit about it, how, it sounds like you both, of course, were doing chaplaincy in a hospital setting. Can you share a little bit about your experience? I mean, of course, we're, still in the pandemic. And so, when did y'all do your chaplaincy, and is there any stories from that you'd like to share? Or
I guess we're going to keep doing Zach 1, Kevin 2. I don't know. Well, so initially I was kind of nervous to enter. I was very proactive. I should say not hyperactive, proactive on getting the vaccine very early on, which I thankfully was very lucky to do so. And I was kind of nervous about entering, but then I did it in the summer. So I did it in the summer of last year, and it was on the downswing. So actually so at the beginning of the summer, everything was closed tight. Middle of the summer, everything opened up. And then by the end of the summer, everything was getting closed tight again. I mean, so it was very, very much that 3-month swing that was going on. We always had to wear a mask. We were not allowed in COVID patient rooms as interns. As staff, you are allowed to make that decision for yourself. No, I mean, the biggest story that will always stand out to me is the night that I got handed off a 19-year-old girl who had been hit by a car and was going downhill really quickly. And she ended up passing, and they did an organ transplant. And I ended up going, I was there with 22 family members, was there when they told the family, was there when they were ready to go to the organ transplant. And I was there in the operation room with the family just before the transplant was going to be removing the organs. It gets me emotional talking about it. I just remember they were playing the song from The Greatest Showman, and her dad was begging her to sing with him. And so that's what sticks out to me. And, I think chaplaincy is the core of ministry, right? I mean, you're just there. You're not there to evangelize. You're just there to walk alongside of the people. And so that story really kind of categorizes, my whole CPE experience.
I began visiting patients, I believe, last September, and continue to do so at least through the end of the month. So have seen, the Delta and its effects. And so things became really, really bad into December and then in January. And so one of the hardest things was just seeing the stress on the hospital staff, the doctors and nurses, and being so frustrated that some of it was preventable. Not that COVID was in general, but just the behaviors of people that led to suffering by people who got COVID, and then our doctors and nurses, and then people who had other health conditions who couldn't receive adequate levels of care because our facilities were maxed out and we were, patients, some patients were being turned away elsewhere. We took in overflow from other hospitals. I had a COVID patient flown in from West Virginia, from Charleston, because they were over capacity there. I didn't go in COVID rooms very often. It was an optional thing. When I did, it was for people who were in the last hours of their lives to be with their families. And it's a even more difficult environment to exist in because it's hard to hear because of all the machines that are running and everybody's in bubble suits, and it's just a really, really hard situation. And it had its effects in every patient room, though. Like Zach said, we had to wear masks all the time. And when a lot of your communication is nonverbal, if everybody has a mask on, it's made more challenging.
Right.
So that was tough. So even though I wasn't in that many COVID rooms, it did just have a constant presence throughout my entire experience there. I did different types of visits. I had my regular unit visits, which was heart and vascular, as well as dialysis. The dialysis patients are there 3 days a week, so they're in a very different circumstance than the heart and vascular. So I had folks that I just saw regularly in dialysis, whereas heart and vascular, I was seeing people often immediately before they were going to have surgery or immediately after. And so they had this immediate crisis with which they were dealing. And then there were the on-call shifts, which are either from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. or 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., usually on Sundays for me because of my schedule. And those are challenging because you're the only chaplain on duty during those times in this gigantic hospital. So you never know what you're going to be called to. We were called to all of the trauma 1, trauma 2, trauma 3 if it was pediatric, the code blues, which were people who were on the cusp of dying. At least they suspected that, the brain attacks. So we would go to all those, and a lot of times our duties were around just contacting family members, doing things that the medical staff they had other things to do, and so our time was better spent, or it was better our time was being spent doing those things than the doctors and nurses. And then when the families arrived, being with them until they could go and be with the patient, whatever the case might be. But there were a lot of hard things that came in through trauma or through the emergency department, as you might suspect. There was a 4-year-old who shot himself with his father's stolen gun. There was not in the emergency department, but there was a 6-month-old who had to be connected to an ECMO device, which is kind of like it's pretty serious when you have to be connected to one of those, because it does your breathing and your heart pumping for you. It's like a lung and heart substitute. And so this was this little 6-month-old who was being connected to this device and just being with his parents on and off throughout the middle of the night into the morning as they awaited the outcome of that surgery. And he is doing much better, which is great, because we didn't suspect that at the time. But there are just a whole range of challenges, though, that come with it.
Yeah, and y'all have kind of spoken a little bit about this already, but you've talked about what does it mean to be a chaplain, what kind of is the role of being a chaplain, and can you talk about that, some of what you think it's important to be a chaplain, and particularly how your faith tradition kind of informs that role in that position?
There's a couple things that I've always seen in chaplaincy. The first thing is to be patient.
Right.
you're not, yes, you're in a sense sometimes running in to put out fires.
Right.
I mean, I did not have any code blues until almost the very end of my time. And you walk really fast and you get in there, but you have to be patient. You cannot run in there and just try to fix things, because most likely, one, you're not going to fix it.
Right.
You're just there to bring comfort and walk alongside people. But the most important thing is listening. Mm-hmm. And not just verbal listening, but listening to the atmosphere of the room, listening to the body language, listening to, you're also listening outside. That night that I had that 19-year-old get hit, I had doctors who were outside the room talking about their condition as the family was going in to say goodbye. And I had to say, look, this is not appropriate. I need you to move. You can't be talking about this while family members are going to say goodbye. And so you really have to be paying attention. And I know we had some members in our cohort who thought that evangelism was key. And I just, I think about it. Would you want somebody, when you went into the hospital, come and say, have you met Jesus? I mean, that doesn't really, that doesn't make any sense to me, to go into a room and say, have you heard of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? Like, no, no, you are meant to embody Jesus. And we're talking about like ecumenical and serving others. So you're meant to embody your faith system, your whatever deity, whatever God you subscribe to. You're meant to embody that to them. You're not there to push that on them. And so that really changes how we operate as a clergy and people of faith. We have to shift our position. And I know yesterday I had to go to talk to 2 people who are currently working on transitioning. And for those of you who don't know what transitioning means, transitioning is a word that we use to say they're moving, at some point will move on to, they will pass. And it's annoying for people, because when I listen for a long time. I will not speak for a very long time. And sometimes it'll get awkward. Sometimes they'll like look at me and want me to say something. And so, that shift, because I love to talk, which it's sometimes it's hard to be quiet. You want to say it's going to be okay, but that's not the answer that you need to put out there. You don't need to talk to comfort yourself. You only need to talk to move the conversation along and make sure the person knows you're listening. And also, I'll end with my dad did CPSP, ran CPSP stuff for a little while. His largest piece of advice that I have taken into account and has been the most helpful is that a well-placed grunt solves a lot of problems. And so if you're sitting there and you don't know what to say, and somebody says something that hits you hard, just grunt, show that you're listening. And that will give them the chance to kind of process what they just said and maybe be able to learn for themselves rather than you or I telling them.
Yeah, to pick up on what Zach said, bearing witness, standing or sitting silently, resisting the urge to fill empty space with words. That's all a big part of it. You're trying to remove who you are from the space because it's not about you. It's about the patient, the patient's family. So it's a struggle to ward off you trying to come in there, and I still do. I'll slip into conversation mode or something like that, and and it's just an ongoing thing to try to resist that urge. You have to redefine, at least for me, it was a redefinition of what success is. Success as a chaplain is a difficult thing to measure. It's been especially challenging for me, and seminary helped a lot in the years before CPE. But coming from the corporate world, a publicly traded company, success was very narrowly defined. My time was measured in 15-minute increments, and every 15-minute increment fell into a category of productivity. Wow. And chaplaincy does not work that way at all. If you don't do any harm, that's a win. Apart from that, it's hard to know whether you left a room better than it was when you showed up, because you can't say that, oh, well, when I left, they were crying. That doesn't mean it was a bad visit. It might mean that something came undone that was stopping up a healing process or something else. So, or if people are laughing when you leave the room, that can be a good thing or a bad thing. You just don't know. Sometimes you stand there and you're just helpless. A classmate of mine in CPE, and that's something we haven't mentioned, but the classroom time in CPE is also very valuable. And I'm in a group of 4 plus our instructor, and one of our class members coined the term, or introduced me to the term, of embracing your impotence in those situations. And sometimes you stand there and you're not doing anything substantive, and I just repeat to myself in my head, it's like, I'm embracing my impotence. I'm just here and I'm bearing witness, and I'll hope that maybe they start to talk, or that maybe my presence is comforting to them in some way. And you do learn to get a feel for when people want you to leave. At least I hope that I've been acting correctly on that impulse, because you are in their space. And so you might have within you the desire to leave a room because you're uncomfortable, and you have to learn to discriminate between that and this idea that, no, they really do want me to leave now. Right. I'm in a position at this point. So that's one of the challenging things to pick up as well. Going into a room with assumptions, I do always look at the chart before I go and visit a patient, not in an emergency department type situation when I get paged, but when I'm doing my regular visits in heart and vascular, I'll look at the chart ahead of time. And, I spent my formative years watching Scrubs instead of ER. And so I don't really know how to read the charts very well. Once in a while, I can pick up little key terms and things that give me some clues of what's going on. But I look at that. If they designated a religious preference, I make note of that. I'll write down the name of their spouse or whoever their contact information, whoever's listed there, just so I might have that name in my head and remember it better if I'm introduced to them, if they're visiting. And, if they have surgery scheduled later in the day or the next day, I might make a note of that. But otherwise, I try to go in without any assumptions, because I was convinced last week, there was one patient in particular who was dealing with colon cancer. And I was convinced when I read the charts for the day that was going to be my hardest visit of the day. And I walk into a room and this person was very upbeat, and they had tackled cancer before, and he was resigned to what was what was in front of him. And he wasn't in any sort of state of denial. Like I said, he had dealt with it before, but it was just unexpected. It was just another example of you just do not know what you're going to encounter when you go into a room. And even when they put their faith traditions, I always put the impetus on them to steer it in that direction. Right. I'm asked as a chaplain to do a spiritual assessment, but not to do a religious assessment. And so I ask questions about, very vague things like, where do you find support? What's sustaining you in this time? But I never put words about God into their mouths, or even if, I know what their tradition is, I wait until they steer it in that direction, because people who explicitly state that they're from a certain religious tradition never mention wanting prayer, and some people who don't mention it, who don't have it in their chart at all, will ask for it. So usually I'll just say something like, is there anything after the conversation's been going on for a while, is there anything I can do while I'm here? Is there anything you need? And that's when the topic comes up, and they'll say, well, it'd be great if you could say a prayer with me. And so then I do try to, note what their faith tradition is. If they're listed as Pentecostal, I might spend a little bit more time talking about the Holy Spirit than someone who's Lutheran or whatever the case might be. But generally, the prayers are similar for those who come from a Christian tradition. But we really, there's no expectation. I think Zach mentioned this. There's no expectation that we will do anything that can even vaguely be considered evangelism, because we have patients from all sorts of faith traditions who come to the hospital, and everyone should receive the same treatment when it comes to pastoral care. Oh, and sorry, I was just going to say, in terms of PCUSA, I don't know. I guess the idea that God is God and I am not is a comforting thing. This isn't dependent on me, whatever is going on. And so that's something else that provides me comfort in the role. Sorry to interrupt though.
It's okay. I forgot that whole part too, but I don't really know United Methodism. Normally if you're a chaplain, you're a deacon, which is the way we'd say, that you're serving in a context outside the local church. You can be an elder, but they don't really have too much on that side. But I wanted to mention, with what Kevin was saying, how did you say it, the impotence part?
Oh yeah, embracing your impotence. Yeah.
Because so I was really overwhelmed when I started CPE, because it's just how I process things, and then I get better. And by the end of the summer, I was running and doing all the things without problem. But my second overnight, so we did one a week. So my second overnight, the second week of CPE, is when I had that young lady who was hit by a car. And so embracing your impotence is huge, because if you go in there and you think you have all the answers, you will quickly find out that you do not. You will quickly find out how mortal you are. And that leads to other conversations me thinking, well, what do I do for my wife if I pass,
Right.
Because you start thinking those things because you're in a hospital setting.
Yeah.
And so embracing your impotence, Kevin, that's a gem. I'm going to have to take that wherever I go.
It's attribute that to Miller, just in case it gets back to him.
So yeah, y'all, obviously you're, in this hospital setting, you're attending to people who are dying, or at the very least, ill, or in those sorts of difficult situations. Are there any practices or traditions that are, unique to your specific faith background that you participated with people during these times?
In the United Methodist Church, not too much. So we couldn't anoint anybody because of COVID. We couldn't touch anybody. We also could not serve communion. And that's hard, right? We came in contact with a lot of Catholic patients who wanted communion because it's a part of who they are in their faith. And we couldn't even, the Catholic priest couldn't even come in and do it. They would only be allowed or even choose to come in if someone was near death. And so a lot of people got frustrated about that. But I think the biggest ones that I used were more around, I don't have it here with me, but we have what's called the Book of Worship in the United Methodist Church. And it has, they have a pocket one, and it's really nice for chaplains because let me tell you, as a chaplain, your pockets are important because you fit in there your notebook for notes. And when you need to grab a chart sticker, you can put it in there as long as you remember to shred it later or to put it in the shredder box. And you carry your pen. We had we called them Voceras, but they're just basically iPhones. And so we would carry an iPhone around, and then we would get paged. with the iPhone. And so you have your entire life in your pockets. And sometimes there's like a snack in there too. So
Right.
it's really important, especially if it's a busy day, which there were some of those that were busy. But in the book of worship, there's some prayers. There's prayers for persons who are near death, persons who are recovering, persons who maybe gone to hospice care. I mean, there's all sorts of different ones, and there's more in the book of the bigger book of worship. You can also, we also would go online and find different prayers for different faith systems. When I was at Christiana, we were fortunate to have a Jewish, he was in the Jewish man who was in the process of becoming a rabbi. And so if we had a Jewish patient who wanted a rabbi, a person who was becoming a rabbi or a rabbi, we could go talk to him. And that was helpful. But other than that, the United Methodist Church, at least I'm sure there are more resources that I just have not found, because when you're in seminary, you're cramming all the time. You don't really have time to read everything else. But yeah.
In terms of things that are important in PCUSA, I guess part of removing what I am when I go in the room is removing my denominational affiliation, because it's not about me. And so I don't know that it really changed anything. And like Zach said, there was no giving communion, and I'm not ordained anyway, so I wouldn't be able to do a baptism or a communion anyway. So those would have maybe been the two things that I would have used the official Presbyterian language for had I done them. We have a couple Catholic priests who work at Hershey Med. And so when we would run into a Catholic patient who wanted communion, we could make a referral to them. And that's a nice thing to have. And not just communion, but any of the sacraments recognized by that church. We have connections in the Muslim community and the Jewish communities as well. And we called upon the latter in recent weeks because we had a couple visiting from Israel, and they were in a car accident and they spoke very little English. And it wasn't a rabbi who came. We just wanted someone who could speak Hebrew and provide some comfort to them. And she was wonderful. She came and was in the hospital into the night and was able to coordinate some things, including a phone call to Israel to make contact with family and someone to help out with getting together their things, which they'd become separated from as the day went on. And so having those outside connections is really important, especially when you're trying to respect the faith traditions or just the communication needs of the people who are hospitalized.
Right. So you both have already mentioned that a little bit of the work you had to do. Working with other faith traditions. Did either of y'all ever personally do work with someone who did not share your faith tradition?
When we talk about faith traditions, and we got to remember too that even in our faith traditions, we work with people who don't share a lot of our views. I mean, whether that be progressive to a conservative or conservative to a progressive. I mean, these are people, there are big gaps, canyons between people, even in Christianity. And so, when you walk into a room, you really have to be able to kind of leave yourself. I mean, disassociating is not always the best way to deal with things, but you do have to dissociate. You have to kind of put aside yourself. And I had that a couple times. I mean, I had people who had opinions that were definitely not consistent with mine, and I had to keep my mouth shut. And that's hard. It's really hard because as a pastor, you're also, another office you're called to do is be a prophet. And so, you can't really do that when you're a chaplain. I had a Jewish woman who had been in the Holocaust. That was a very interesting conversation and working with her, but she was now UU. And so that was that was different. Other than that, I mean, there weren't really many conversations. I found a lot of the people were just real chill and nice. I mean, and if they wanted you there, they didn't really, and they may have believed something different. They didn't really like try to be mean to you. I had 2 times. I had one woman who tried to convert me to Catholicism really hard, and I had one gentleman who laughed at me because I was a chaplain, and then I just left. So I mean, it really, typically I just find that they like having somebody who is willing to come to their room and say hi. And if they want to talk really short conversation, that's fine. If they don't want to talk, it's up to them. So you want them to have all the power in the conversation, because these people have no power in a day-to-day basis typically. And that's a huge conversation that we could have about power in a hospital.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely.
There were plenty of folks who came from different religious traditions, and I don't really feel like it changed my approach very much, because again, you try to avoid going into the room with any sort of assumptions. You need to be respectful of situations where someone might come from a religious tradition where, for instance, it's not appropriate for a woman to speak to a man, and so you need to be aware of situations like that. But usually that information would come out ahead of time, and we would make accommodations for that. So otherwise, it didn't really change the conversation. Most people didn't steer the conversation in the direction of the religious. We could talk about spiritual related things, or just where they're finding support, or getting them to talk about their families. Or a lot of times people whose faith tradition was important to them, their ministers or the leaders of their church might have already come and done those more specific things that they were interested in. And that's great. There don't seem to be many people who have that now. I think it's just a nature of the day and age we live in, with fewer people going to church. But yeah, it didn't really change the conversation that much.
So here's a big question. What do you wish you had known before you started chaplaincy?
This is a hard one. I felt completely ready because I had done all those things beforehand. I think personally, you just need to be aware that you will likely get hurt at some point. You will likely, and it doesn't necessarily mean you'll get that from a patient. That could be that somebody in your cohort will say something aimed at you that is hurtful, or aimed in just general, and you just get hurt because you're the kind of person who gets hurt when people are hurt.
Right.
And that's a huge one too, is if you're very empathetic, be prepared to be very empathetic to everybody. I'm a 9 on the Enneagram, which means I feel emotion very, very, very strongly. And there were times when I went in a room and cried, and just stayed there for a couple minutes, breathed, had a snack. The night that the young person died, I called my wife right after, and I talked to her for like 30 minutes. I actually just called her. I called her and I was like, can we just sit quietly together for a little bit, even digitally? And she just watched me eat a thing of chocolate pudding. So I mean, you just got to be ready to feel all the feels, and to be hurt. I mean, and I've come to view being hurt is not always a bad thing. Like there are hurts that are horrible and the people that are horrible, but being hurt is sometimes good because it builds your resiliency. And so when we take those times and we're able to recover and heal from the trauma, and not just to let it, not to let it hit us and then never deal with it, but when you deal with it, it makes you into a better person. So when you go for somebody else, that hurt has already impacted and transformed you in some way. So you can be of love and care to them. I think a lot about Henry Nouwen and the wounded healer, and showing some of that to other people, because people, when you show that you're human, people will respond to you.
What I wish I'd known ahead of time, we are required to park in the outer edges of the parking lot, like almost as far away as the hospital as you can get without going off road. And so I wish someone had told me, especially for the colder months, the shortest route to take to get to the building. I finally, after a lot of experimentation, because it's really hard to get around in the hospital. They spend a lot of time during training trying to tell you how to get around in the hospital, and yet I still get turned around a lot. But I finally figured out, after some experimentation, how to make my way from the hospital through the tunnel thing, through the university physician center, so that I could stay indoors as long as possible before venturing outside. So I wish someone had told me that. We had a really good pastoral care class that provided a lot of the preparation, but there aren't, and we had also had the opportunity to speak to other folks who had been in CPE, even for me, even within Hershey. And so much of it's constantly a learning process. And, if I continued on into residency, I think I would continue to learn new things every time I went to the hospital, but it's experiential stuff. There's no, I can't think of anything that someone could have told me going into it I just can't isolate anything like that.
Right.
They told us where to buy the cheapest cup of coffee, really, really basic practical thing. We're allowed to park in the close garage when we're doing an overnight, little factual things like that. But the really valuable learning, you just can't learn without doing it.
Right. You just got to go experience it for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So my father is actually a doctor himself, and he used to tell stories about when he would do those crazy 30-hour shifts in residency, and he would just talk about he'd come out of that and just completely be destroyed. You kind of thing like y'all talk about, where you'd come out of that and you just witnessed all sorts of just terrible things. You just got to kind of keep going. And so I'm just remembering a lot of that from what the stories y'all are talking about. So yeah. And I think you both mentioned this before, but I just want to repeat it just because I personally forgot, but some of the plans y'all have for after you finish seminary. So
I also noticed that Chelsea sent a question too in the chat, but
thank you.
plans after seminary. I mean, so the United Methodist Church, we're what's called we take a vow of a covenant of itinerancy. And itinerancy is a big fancy way of saying that we are moved around at the bishop's will. The bishop and the cabinet meet, they pray, and they say, okay, you're going to go there. So I actually will be moving. So I will graduate in May. We'll have a little bit of time in between, and then we'll be moving, my wife and I, to another church setting with 4 churches. I'll be an associate pastor. And so that's really what's like right up next. But after that, I'll be looking to get commissioned, which is basically the fancy way of starting teacher tenure in the United Methodist Church. 2 years, and then you have to complete a major project and another whole kind of like dissertation like material, and then go back and you can get ordained an elder, which is basically means you have guaranteed, right now it means guaranteed appointment. You have the ability to do the sacrament anywhere, and some other things. It's also very, it's like teachers, you're guaranteed to have a something to do, which is good. And then, we're looking forward to wherever God leads us. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going in the United Methodist Church in our lives. And so hopefully things, we want things to quiet down, but I don't think that's going to happen for a few years, at least. So.
As for the cohort experience, like I said, it's a group of 4 of us and our supervisor, and we meet on Monday mornings, and we've read books together and discussed those. We do verbatims, which is where you share about a encounter you had with a patient, and we look at those through, all sorts of different directions. It's a great experience. One of the folks is doing his 3rd unit of CPE, one is doing his 2nd, and then the other 2 of us are doing our 1st. And so we've also had the opportunity to learn a lot from the more experienced members. And even though I don't have any, I'm not part of the residence group, but when I'm there for my unit time on Tuesday afternoons, a couple of the residents are generally in that same office space as I am. And just being able to ask the residents questions and just hear them talk has also been really educational for me. As for my plans after graduation, I'm currently working with PCUSA's 1001 New Worshiping Communities group or organization to found a new worshiping community. What was I going to say? Oh, that I was accepted into the apprenticeship for that, and that'll begin this fall. But I'm a Gen Xer, and so during the course of my life, I've seen a lot of people my age leave the church, and then I've seen a lot of millennials and Gen Z folks never start to attend church in the first place. And there are a lot of valid reasons for that in a lot of those cases. And so my hope is to start a faith community that fills a gap that existing churches in our presbytery don't. So just something that would be appealing to them. I have a passion for environmental justice, and so my hope is to marry that with this new faith community, doing things like worshiping outdoors and just having other related activities that might appeal to folks who just haven't found a home in the faith communities that exist in our region. So that's my hope for the coming months.
As for the cohort question that Chelsea asked, speak to both what the cohort experience was like and why the cohort is there and how it functions. So we've been referring mostly to like the cohort in seminary, but like our cohort it's called really a group. Sometimes depends on who your teacher is, but in CPE, in my experience, cohort has its ups and downs. I don't want to share too much because obviously what I experienced with others is confidential and such, but there were conflicts, there were misunderstandings, there were outright attacks sometimes, whether they were meant to be or not, that's to whatever, that's that person's responsibility. But the cohort is there. So when you do CPE, one of the goals of CPE is to make yourself more aware of yourself and other and how you impact others. And so, you may come into the group thinking, the way you do X is great, but then you come in and there's a certain person there who X offends, and you may be asked, well, maybe you need to change that. Not that this was offensive, but this was a question posed to me my first or second week was, why do you feel the need to ask if they're a Christian or not? Like I would ask them, or I would ask what their faith was so that I could know. And I stopped doing that, and I would just let them bring up God in whatever way they bring up God. And it made such a huge difference in that. And so, and we would meet every Wednesday for almost 6 to 8 hours on Zoom. And basically we would do what's called verbatims, or rather verbatims are part of the bigger, what's called case studies. And a case study basically is you take an event that you had and you write it down and kind of like give a summary, and then you give a dialogue like in a movie script with feelings about it. And you just you read it, you would go through it with your group, you would present it like you would present like a case in a court, but you're not really defending yourself, you're just presenting it. And so, they would then ask you questions about it. Why did you do X? What made you think this was the best thing? And then, they can share their thoughts on what was wrong with whatever. And so the cohort functions both as a learning peer group and also a group to lean on. I mean, each of us buddied up. So we had 6. So we each kind of buddied up. I had another UMC, and then there was another clique of 2, and then, kind of that. So we each kind of had support for each other. So if we had someone who was nervous about something, they could talk to us about that. It wasn't really official, but it was just what we ended up being.
Yeah, Zach's mention of how long they spent in their group every week highlights a decision that you need to make when you choose how to do your CPE, and that's whether to do an extended unit, which runs the course of a regular school year, or whether to do a summer intensive. And Zach went with the summer intensive, which I think intensive is probably a great word for that, because even the extended unit can be intense at times. So to take that entire experience and put it into a much shorter period of time, it means more on calls within a given period of time. It means more class time, longer durations within the unit. So it really is kind of an all-encompassing thing if you choose that. What I was facing, the decision I had to make was, do I fulfill my Hebrew requirement for PCUSA in the summer or over the course of the school year? And then I knew I couldn't do it concurrently with CPE, and I chose to extend CPE across my final year of seminary and to do a Hebrew intensive last summer. And I'm glad that I did it that way. I probably don't know as much. I probably haven't retained as much Hebrew as I would have if I had taken it over a longer period of time, because I even though Greek was longer ago, I remember more Greek. But seeing as how it's not the 1980s anymore and we have Bible Hub, I think that the skills that you get in CPE are far more important than the skills you pick up in Hebrew class, with apologies to my teacher Denise for saying that. But I think the fundamentals, I think you still get the fundamentals from that. So
I promise I won't share that with your denomination. I think
they'll learn soon enough.
No, I always second that. Whenever someone says, I'm thinking about doing Greek or Hebrew, I say, do it in the summer. Just knock it out. Just knock it out. Always do that. So we're getting ready to kind of finish up here, starting to close up. So I think one thing I wanted to ask you at the end is just to kind of briefly just mention some of how this experience changed you, or how it impacted you, and any other kind of last thoughts you'd like to leave here. So.
I know that I at the beginning said, that CPE, it really changed a lot of how I do ministry.
Right.
As a leader, you have to determine whether to be passive or to be, right on top of things and in there. And usually it's somewhere in the middle. And that's the same as a chaplain. You have to be able to make the decisions of when you need to be forthright and say something, or when you don't. But I think the thing about CPE is you just it refocuses priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, when you have, say, for instance, a conflict within your church or something, and, I don't know, someone sat in my pew, when you show up at CPE and you're there with so-and-so who has 5 weeks to live, or is going to die soon. I took a woman down to see her husband who was dying in the ER with pneumonia and Alzheimer's, who didn't know who she was until I said, "Here's your beautiful bride." And his arm stretched out for all of 5 seconds and took her hand and then let go. I mean, it just refocuses. What are we doing? What are we fighting for? We have people who are dying and trying to die with dignity, but some who are just dying. I mean, they're not dying with dignity, and not because the hospital did anything, but just because their illness doesn't allow them to. And it refocuses what's important in life and what's important in the career that you're doing. Because ministry, yes, it's a calling, but it's also a career. And, I think that that's important, because, and it's funny because like the things that happen at church, when you don't have any of these moments come up, they all seem so life ending. But then once you run into this, it's like, that is nothing compared to what that person is going through. I had to go see the two people who were transitioning yesterday, and it kind of like flipped that focus back again, that I hadn't done CPE for a while. So it helped, but it's all about the other thing in ministry that I have realized about like how I minister is, and if you ever, I'd already learned some of this, but there's a gentleman named Jack Shatama, who is who ran Camp Pacomath here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland for a long time, who wrote a book about, it's called Anxious People, Anxious Church, or something like that. But basically the idea of being a non-anxious presence for these people. And for everyone around you, because you learn that very, very strongly in CPE. You go into a room, you may feel like crap, you may feel like you want to turn right around and run, but you can't. You have to just be calm and be chill, even if they disagree with you or whatever. And so how do we be that? And I think CPE, it really teaches you that. And if you can embody that anywhere in any situation. I've had some people like, why are you so calm? How did you get through these situations? I'm like, well, because, I learned not to let everything rattle me. And so I think that that's important. Something I've learned and grown in CPE. And, the ability to, Kevin mentioned our class in pastoral care. They talked about how we guide conversations in that class, and like the ability to actively listen to people, to either to, say, oh, really, you had to go such and such, to echo their words, and not to ask many questions, but to kind of guide them to their own conclusions rather than conclusions you forced upon them, is another big one. And that really hones out, it really gets kind of honed in CPE. So.
I'll limit myself to three things. One is there's a lot of value in learning how a hospital works, because we probably all will end up in a hospital in one way or another, most of us anyway, at some point. So just knowing what happens when you go in the emergency department and how you go from here to there, and then you find your way to this type of room and then that type of room. And that's valuable as a pastor, but it's valuable as a human being living in America as well. So that's been really valuable. I already had a lot of respect for doctors and nurses. That's only been amplified. The importance of getting an advance directive in place. It's not something fun, but you really, before another week goes by, figure out how you want to die, what you want that to look like, what you want the types of circumstances to be, because the default is to keep people alive by any means possible, regardless of their mental state or anything else, if there's nothing in place. Plus, seeing the families go having to make those decisions on the worst days of their lives, if there's something in place that can just have that be predetermined, it makes an incredibly difficult situation a little easier for them, because just watching people agonize over those decisions is heartbreaking. So get your advance directive in place. And then finally, it really makes you focus on your mortality a lot, which is valuable. It really helps put things in perspective. So it's hard not to think about your mortality when you're surrounded by so many people who can think of nothing but that. So those are just three things for me.
Well, I want to thank y'all so much for being willing to participate in this and be the opening interview for this series. And thanks for just sharing these stories. I mean, they really are something that I'm going to carry with me certainly through this afternoon and rest of the day. Yeah, I hope you all have a good upcoming Easter. And thanks once more for this. So it's been a good time, good hour.
Thank you.
All righty.